Hi, everyone. In this lecture, I want to cover the topic of driver warnings. So, if we're going to play a sound or flash a light to warn you that you're about to hit another car or go to another lane, or there's a car in your blind spot, etc., how should we do that? And as we'll see, it's actually quite a complicated question because there's lots of factors we need to take into account, lots of human factors issues. The first kind of thing we want to start with is what do we actually want to do with the warning, right? Do we want it to elicit an immediate response? So as soon as you hear the sound, you step on the brakes, no matter what's happening. Okay, that's one thing that we could do. Or you turn, right? In general, we don't want to do that, right? Unless it's absolutely necessary. For example, the very last second, because there's a problem because if there's any unreliability in the warning, right, where you're going to slam on the brakes when you don't have to, which increase the chance someone from behind is going to hit you. You don't want to do that. A much better thing we'd rather do with warnings is we give some signal and it causes you to shift your attention to the road and figure out for yourself what needs to be done. Maybe nothing needs to be done. Maybe you need to steer, maybe you need to brake, but that's a much better way to warn someone than trying to elicit immediate response. Okay. And another issue that comes in this is how we're going to orient your attention, right? So if we're going to choose that second route of trying to get you to shift your attention to the road, we can do that in kind of one or two different ways, right? We can do it endogenously, which means it's driven from inside of you, right? So what that occurs with is when we present something that has no natural information or link to the event we're trying to signal, right? So if I play a beeping sound, you're driving and I play a beeping sound, beeping doesn't mean anything to you, right? You have to learn that beeping means collision, right? So what happens is you hear the beeping, in your memory, you remember that means collision, you purposely shift your attention to the road. That's called endogenous, right? So that's called endogenous orienting, coming from within. Um, these can be useful, obviously, right? The person is driving, but they have limitations because, right, you can also choose not to react to it, right? You can choose to ignore the beeping because it's driven from within you. The better type of warning that we'll see, and we'll talk a little bit about this, is exogenous orienting. So, exogenous orienting is when there's a link between the signal you're getting and what the event is, right? And I could give you an example right now. If someone banged on my door right now, I would shift my attention there automatically. I couldn't help but do it, right? So it's not coming from within me, it's driven from the outside world. That's what exogenous means, right? Same when you hear a car horn, right? When you hear a car horn, you cannot really help but shift your attention to it, right? Because there's a natural link between when we hear that sound, right, and the event, right? Another one that I really love, as I mentioned last time, are when you have the little reflectors on the road on the edge of the lane line. When you go out of that, it gives an immediate signal. You know that it means I need to turn back in, right? So in these, there's a natural link between the stimulus, the warning, and the event, such that you don't really need a lot of interpretation or memory, right? You don't need to remember that the beeps mean collision, two beeps mean collision, three means I'm going out of my lane. You know automatically, right? And so these are good because they're really fast and the driver can't really step in and stop them, right? Because they're kind of automatic. Okay. Other kind of human factors issues we can see when we come into warnings are modality, right? So we talked about when we talked about attention, we talked about multiple resource theory, the idea that you might have separate channels for your different modalities. Well, we know that vision is very absorbed during driving, right? That's driving is mostly a visual task. You need to look outside to steer and brake and so on. It can also be fairly heavily loaded with auditory tasks. For example, if you're talking on the phone, listening to the radio. So maybe we don't want to use, especially not vision for a warning, we want to use some other sensory modality. The other event problem can be the spatial correspondence between the critical event and the warning, right? So imagine I'm going to signal a collision by vibrating the gas pedal, the accelerator pedal. So you're driving along, the vibration on your foot signals something happening out there. Obviously, those two things aren't happening in the same place, right? Or imagine I have a sound coming out of the speaker on your dashboard trying to signal a car is out there on the road you're going to hit, right? The problem with that, right? Maybe your attention is going to go to the speaker, not to the car, right? So we need to think about those kind of issues. Timing is one of the things that most studied in warning research, right? Because it's a very complicated problem, right? We can't warn you too late, right? Because we need to take into account of drivers' reaction time, right? So here's a bunch of studies looking at drivers' reaction times to signals, right? They're on average probably like 1 second, right? So if we warn you a second and a half before you're going to hit another car, that might be too late, right? By the time you detect the warning and respond and know what to do, you might have already hit it. At the same time, we don't want to warn too early, right? If we warn you 5 seconds before you're going to hit a car, you don't really need to do anything at that point. So it's going to annoy you, and you probably shut it off if that's an option for you, right? They so we really need to find the sweet spot of warning you early enough so you can do something, but not too early to bother you. Okay. The other thing we can do, and a lot of people have had the idea of using multiple warnings, right? So one way that we could um, deal with some of these issues I've already been talking about, right? For example, modality or timing is maybe I could give you a visual warning when you're a very mild visual warning when you're about 4 seconds before hitting a car, say 3 seconds. I could start flashing a light. So it's not too bothersome, your chance of detecting it. But as you get closer, I'll give you a really loud horn sound right in your car as the time gets lower. These are good ideas, but we have to deal with something called the psychological refractory period, right? When two things happen too close in a time, you can miss the second one, okay? Because your brain is essentially still responding to the first one. It takes some time to recover, right? So that's what we mean by that, right? So if we have one stimulus followed by a very short time after another one, you're going to miss it, right? If it's too close together. That's called the psychological refractory period, as I said. Another thing, and we've talked about this issue already, that's a really critical thing for warnings is reliability, right? What I mean by that is how often do they actually accurately indicate what they're supposed to, right? What we want to avoid here, right, is the cry wolf phenomenon, right? If a warning keeps going off, right, when nothing happening, it gets annoying. People don't like it. That's called what we call a false alarm, right? And they'll disable it, or they'll just start to ignore it, right? And this can happen. An example of this kind of I've heard people talk about recently. If you have any kind of cameras, like a Ring camera on your house or anything like that, sometimes if you set those too wide, the sensors, camera, you can get alarms going out, your beeps going off for when a car drives along the street, when it's too windy, right? Those kind of when they're really nothing you need to care about, right? And if that happens, at the very least, you're going to start not caring about your notifications as much, and at very worst, you're going to turn them off. So we really need to think about reliability issues. And the way that we do this in research is using something called signal detection theory, which actually was developed from radar operators in in the World War II, I believe, where people were watching radar screens to detect for incoming enemy fighters, right? And in signal detection research, what we do is we divide the possible outcomes you can get, right? So imagine there's a collision about to occur in less than 3 seconds, so in 2 seconds, and I give you a warning, right? That's called a hit, right? Not you that you hit the car. It's called a hit because it's a good thing, right? And the green checks here mean good things. The warning is warning you when it should, right? It's coming on when you need to do something. A miss would be when the warning doesn't activate when it really should. So if it's less than 2 seconds and there's no signal, that's called a miss. The other two events, it could be, so imagine there's a long time before you hit the car and the warning comes on. That's a false alarm. Imagine there's a long time before you're going to hit the car and there's no warning given. That's called what's called a correct rejection. And what we really want is a balance between these things, right? We really want, and the way that I'll show you in a second, is we want a balance between these two things, hits and false alarms. We want a high number of hits, right? Right. We want it to go on when it should, right? And think about the camera on your house, right? Every time someone walks up to the door, we want it to go on, right? Pretty much, or 99% of the time, right? So we want a high number of hits, but we want to balance that against the number of false alarms. To achieve that, going off every time someone walks to your door, we don't want to trigger it anytime there's a car go by or wind or something. So we need to balance these two things. And the way that we do that in research is we use a measure called D prime, right? Which is basically the difference between hits, which we want to be high, and false alarms, which we want to be low. And I'll show you some examples of research that have used this. It comes with a number basically between, 1 and 4, where 3 or 4 is good, a good system, and less than 3 is a bad system. Okay. Um, so any system, there's a trade-off. It depends on the criteria, right? What do you which do you value more, right? So in driving, right, if I fail to warn you in an important situation, you're potential for a collision, right? So I probably want to emphasize hits, right? I make sure the hits level is very high. The cost of that is going to be, a fairly high number of false alarms. I'm going to have to warn you sometimes when you really don't need to do anything, which is going to be a bit annoying. But the consequence of a missed warning in driving is very high. A rear end, the cost, it's a rear end collision, which is very dangerous, right? The cost of a false alarm is just kind of annoyance, right? So it's important, but not as important, right? Versus think about again the Ring camera or the security camera on your house, right? The cost of missing someone walking up to your door, right? With the number of people that walk up to people's doors now, it's not the end of the world, right? It's not the end of the world. So maybe whereas your phone constantly going off telling you something's going on, maybe that's a bit more important, especially when you're a consumer product, like you have competition, Ring versus Y, all these other types of cameras. Maybe in that case, we want to emphasize a bit lower false alarms, right? So it depends on what you're trying to achieve. Okay. So let's start with visual collision warnings. So the initial warnings people had were, so we're going to mainly focus on collision warnings today. So warnings telling you that you're about to hit a car in front of you, right? So initially there was warnings like this that had on the dashboard. In general, what we find is these don't work very well, right? In general, there's a high false alarm rate. They're annoying and distracting. With visual warnings, people miss a lot of them because, right, going back to our multiple resource theory, your vision is taken up, right? You're looking at the road, other cars, your phone, whatever, right? So there's kind of this problematic, and this is some initial work on these, right? So in this study, what they did was to have people do car following tasking in a driving simulator. Okay. And what would happen is if you got within a time headway of 2 seconds, the alarm would go off. Okay. And what they did is measure the number of collisions, the back reaction time, and basically how much time you spent in that danger zone of less than 2 seconds high time headway. Okay. And what they had in this was just abstract sounds or speech alerts where they'd say alert, right? And they have varied things like the reliability of the warning, whether it was the hit rate was 60%, 80%, or 95%. They varied false alarms. So they did a lot of different things in this study. Okay. And they used the signal detection theory analysis. So they broke down the events into either hits or false alarms. Okay. And what did they find? So they used D prime. Okay. They used, the look at the effectiveness of warning. So first of all, they looked at how effective was the warning when you gave it. How effective the driver drive. They also looked at another issue we haven't talked about yet. One of the things we also want to avoid in warnings is kind of cue dependency, right? And an example of this I can give you in driving is people when you have a signal in your car that beeps when you leave your headlights on, right? So it'll beep at you when you leave your headlights on when you try to leave your car. What can happen with that? And this I've noticed this myself on me. If you have a car like that and you switch to some other car that doesn't, you leave the headlights on, right? You become super dependent on that warning being there, right? And without it, you fail to check things. So we don't want that either. That's an important thing we want to consider. Okay. So what we see here, what they've shown here is the This is the proportion of time the driver spent in time headway of less than 2. Well, you can see they spent 12% with no warnings. When you add warnings, it's less, 7%, which is good. Um, when you have a system, the driver makes more false alarms when the system makes false alarms. So the driver steps on the brakes when they don't need to. Okay. Which is a bad thing, of course. When you're giving lots of false alarms, you're going to make the driver do lots of false alarms. Okay. Um, Cue dependency, whether people were reacting even when the warning was unreliable, was worse when there's the speech interface. Okay. It was best when you combine. And this is going to be a common theme that you find in warning research. The best warnings are really ones that combine different sensory modalities instead of relying on just one. Okay. So that's what they found. Okay. So overall, they found drivers spend less time in the danger zone of a time headway less than 2 with warnings. Okay. In their study, the reliability of the warning system didn't really affect things, except that what happens is drivers were being a bit more cautious, right? They'd step on the brakes when they didn't have to, right? That sounds good, but there's a couple issues. One is you don't have the option to deactivate it. And the second thing is you're not a car company competing against other vehicles, right? So we have to take into that account too, right? If I work for Ford and I design a warning system that's giving you lots of false alarms and bothering you, if you have the option, maybe you're going to either shut it off or go somewhere else. So having these drivers be super cautious because you keep giving false alarms sounds good in theory, but it's not in practice. I don't think it would be a good thing. Okay. So let's look at some other issues in modality. Okay. For a long time, people thought auditory warnings would be good because they seem to evoke kind of this automatic alerting response, right? When people hear a loud sound, they know it means danger, right? And so they maybe we could use that to instead of a visual warning because this kind of this built-in response. This has turned out to be a bit more challenging than that, right? Not as simple as that for a few reasons. One is that effect seems to be very transient. So if I warn you with a loud sound, you do get this alerting effect, but it goes away quickly, right? So if the event doesn't occur right after I warned you, within a few hundred milliseconds, then it doesn't really have a beneficial effect. Okay. There's also a person named Judy Edworthy has done many years has done research on auditory warnings, and she found there's a lot of issues. Too loud. If you make a auditory warning too loud, you go from having the person alert to having them kind of duck and cover, right? Kind of making them freeze. Too many auditory warnings. We're going to see this when we get to aviation, right? So if you get what's happening, you can put one for going out of your lane, for hitting a car, for maybe my turn's coming up. If you get too many of them, the driver gets confused and they have to remember what each one means. Another issue that comes with warning, especially if you want to use a warning to try to get the driver to put their attention in a certain direction, right? So imagine there's a car coming onto the road, or say, let's do a pedestrian warning. Imagine I'm driving along the road and there's a pedestrian about to walk on the street from the left side. So I want to warn the driver and get them to look to the left, right? To notice that pedestrian and stop, right? The problem with auditory warnings is it can be difficult to know where they're coming from, right? Because the main way that we localize sound, so we know where a sound coming from, is by actually using what's called an interaural difference, right? We compare what's happening in our left ear to our right ear. And there's actually what happens because their two ears are separated on our head, we get these little differences that we can use to localize, right? So one of them is a intensity difference, right? So imagine you have a sound coming from your left, right? It's going straight into your left ear. So it's going to be fairly loud. Your right ear, it's got to go, your head's blocking it, right? So it's got to go either around your head, right? So it's going to be muffled by your head, right? So it's going to create, if we measure the number of decibels at my left ear versus my right ear, it's going to be different. And you get this effect because your head creates this sound shadow, right? It's blocking part of the sound and muffling it. And this is what you find, right? So just look at the top graph here. If we have a sound coming directly from your left, it's about 20 or so decibels louder in your left ear than your right ear, okay? Which is quite a big difference, right? Obviously, a sound coming from straight ahead, there's going to be no difference, right? Because it has the same path to my left ear. So you can see the difference goes down to 0 decibels. So I can tell where sound is coming from, either straight ahead, 0 difference, or all the way to my left, 20 decibels or 10 decibels here, depending on this, what's called the IID, interoral, the interoral intensity difference, right? So that's it. The other one is a time difference, right? So in the, vernacular of physics, right, sound travels relatively slow, right? Especially compared to light, right? That's why, thunder and lightning appear to be separated when they're far away. The thunder occurs after the lightning because the lightning, even though they actually happen at the same time, the light gets to you faster. Therefore, if I have a sound coming from my left again, it's going to take a finite, slightly longer to get all the way around to my right ear than it did to my left ear. And again, this varies with the direction of the sound, right? So a sound coming right from in front of me, there's going to be no time difference. A sound coming all the way from my left, notice these are really small, zero 0.6 milliseconds, right? That's really, really small number. That's, hard to measure that accurately. But it turns out our auditory system is incredibly good at getting the timing of sound, noticing small time differences. Right? That's really a lot of how we perceive speech. So again, we get the same kind of pattern, right? We can tell where sound is coming from, in this case, by the time difference between our ears. But there's a problem, right? There's a problem because each of them only works well for certain frequencies of sound, certain pitches of sound, right? So intensity differences work well for high frequencies. If I get a really low frequency of sound, like a bass sound, you can see there's no difference, right? Why? Because low frequencies can kind of bend around your head. So there's not really much of a sound shadow created. It works better for high frequencies. Time differences, they work better for the opposite, right? They work better for low frequencies than high frequencies, right? So if we get right in the middle, we have this kind of soft spot where neither of them works optimally, so we can have problems um, localizing the sound. And a good example of this is a watch alarm, right? Watch alarms, right, or sometimes even phone ringtones. Think about what happens when one goes off beside you, right? Often people will do this, right? We would never do that for a video. If you saw a flash of light over there, would you think it was on your arm? No, all right? So we're way better at localizing things visually. Why are watch alarms that frequency then, they're hard to locate? Well, there's actually kind of a trade-off here between detection and localization, right? So detecting, noticing that there's a signal there, noticing it's time to get up, right? Those frequencies are different than the ones that are optimal for localization. So this is some of the things you have to deal with when you're creating a auditory warning. Okay. Um, the difference, there's a problem in knowing whether the sound coming from behind you or in front of you. Okay. They call the cone of fusion. So as I mentioned, auditory warnings, there's some challenges. There's also, you have background noise in your car, rumblings and sound. So we want to kind of put it in the frequency range that's out of that background noise, right, to separate the signal from the noise, which may not be optimal for localization, right? So there's all these kind of challenges. Okay. Let's look at some actual research that's been done. So this study was looking at kind of the psychological refractory period. What happens if I'm using warnings not only for safety, but to warn you in the infotainment unit? You have a new email or you have a new text message. What happens then? So what they did in this study was they used a warning for collision, warning, and a warning telling you that you were going to get an email, and they've made them reasonable, right? The collision warning was much more intense and loud. The email warning was more like what you get on a computer, right? And what they looked at was whether how the two were related, if they had similar timings, right? So you get a faster response to a higher intensity warning. But what they found was evidence in support of that psychological refractory period effect, right? If the email warning came too close to the collision warning, you didn't detect it as well, and you had slower reaction time. Okay. A person that's done some interesting work, and I'm not going to tell you in this lecture, I've also worked with him. We've done some work on warnings, is Charles Spence. So this is work with that he did with his graduate student, Christy Ho. what they did was to look at trying to localize warnings and using different kind of modalities. So what they did was to try to create warnings where they actually had speech saying look left or look right, right? So instead of relying on you to detecting the sound came from the left, and which we saw was not always we're best at, maybe I can get you to shift by using a cue. So what they did was have a cueing paradigm. So they had look left or look right. Then they had something you had to detect in the scene, either on the left or the right. And they varied kind of the timing between them and the validity. So sometimes they would say, look right, look left when the target was actually on the right. And they saw what happened. Okay. And what they found was your reaction time was better. Okay. Verbal cues are only better when there's a really short time between the cue and the event, right? So when I say look left, if the event is right there, the pedestrian stepping out, then they work well. If I say look left and it's not another, it's a second before the person comes out, then what happens is you shift your attention somewhere else. Okay. You come there, you see there's nothing, and you move your attention away. So they can be not very effective. Another thing that Charles has done, and I've worked on with this one as well, is using vibrotactile signals. So using touch, vibration, to deliver a warning instead of vision, as obviously we've seen is not very effective at all because you're really using your vision a lot in driving. Auditory, you can have phones and radio, etc. One thing that's not really used at all is your sense of touch. Okay. So what they've done is to use um, the vibrations in the seat, through the seat belt, on the steering wheel, to see if we can use those as warnings for the driver, right? There's lots of basic research showing that this works. So what they did in this study was they had person driving in a simulator. They presented the warning on this vibration on your seatbelt. Okay. And so they were doing this task, they were driving, and what their task was to do, they had to step on either if the car started to go away from you, you had to accelerate. If the car started to come towards you, you were supposed to hit the brakes, right? So, and what they did was give a warning, this vibration through the seatbelt, to tell you what was happening. Okay. So that these are actually seatbelt. So there's two types of warnings: one in the seatbelt on your stomach, or one through the seat on the back on your back. So the one on your stomach was meant to tell you to brake. The one on the back was meant to tell you to speed up. And they've also varied the validity. So there's a lot going on in this study. Um, what they found was that vibrotactile cues were very effective, right, in this situation. People had decrease in reaction time of braking and accelerating of about 60 milliseconds on average, which is really quite a significant difference, right? So these seems to be more effective in a lot of ways than the visual and auditory cues we've already looked at. Okay. They also asked, whether is this an exogenous effect or an endogenous one? So is it the case that you get the vibration on your seatbelt, then you deliberately, voluntarily shift your attention forward, then you brake? Or is it happening automatically? And what they did to test this is to make the cues invalid, right? And one way you can tell whether something is exogenous, right? It's driven from the outside, is you will shift even when it's not very reliable, right? So if someone keeps knocking on my door, I'll keep looking over there, even if nothing happens, because I've learned, right? It's a very strong cue that I really can't stop, right? And what they found was that indeed it's the case. So this is a graph showing the difference between the front and back when they're reliable, right? You get a big difference. When they're unreliable, this response is much smaller, but it's still there, right? Which suggests that vibrotactile cues are really exogenous, right? They're causing the shift kind of naturally rather than having to drive it yourself. Okay. They've also replicated this study using a more advanced driving simulator. So they had people keeping 2 seconds headway with a car. They had the lead car braking in front of you, or a following car actually accelerating that was going to hit you. And what they had was, again, warnings in front or back to signal these events. There's also people who were looking at this so there's the simulator. They were looking at this little display, telling you whether you're too close or too far away from the car in front. And what they found was that when you have a valid collision warning, so a warning in front when you're about to hit the car in front, and in back when the car in back is going to hit you, you get really low, fast reaction times, right? So it's really good. It's much faster than when you have no warning at all. So the warning seems to be very effective. And even invalid warning, so vibrating your front with the seatbelt when there's something going on in back, even that is better than doing nothing at all, right? So vibratactile warnings seem to be a very promising way to warn people. And as I said, I've done a bunch of research on that as well. Okay. The problem, though, is that people don't really like them, especially if they're going to be used in this kind of way, because they're kind of annoying, right? Vibration through the seatbelt all the time, vibration on the back all the time can get annoying, and people didn't really like these at all. So we have this kind of trade-off you get in warning research between things that work and things that people like, right? Is kind of a tough thing. And this is one of the differences that I like to point out that we'll talk about between the two things we're talking about in this course, driving and flying. In flying, if we find something that works and it's going to help with safety, we can just put it in there. We can mandate it, right? The FAA can say you have to have vibrotactile warnings in your seat. In driving, we can do that a little bit, right? We can mandate safety regulations like every car has to have a seatbelt, every car has to have this kind of the high brake light. But they can only take that so far, right? Because most of these things are going to be choices made by the car manufacturer. And an annoying thing is not, you can't just force people to use it if other car companies aren't doing it, right? So it's a problem, it's a challenge there. Okay. The other type of warning is, we talked a little bit about these when we're talking about intelligent transportation systems, is lane departure warnings. These can be done with sound again, vibration. One effective one that we've used is vibrating the seat, under your left leg when you're going to go out the left side of the lane, on the right leg, right? So there's lots of different ways you can do that. You can also, we've worked on, having a haptic drivers delivering vibrations through the back of the seat is another thing we've worked on. Okay, that's it for this lecture on driver warnings.